Show with me, Swift Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Rik Storey to discuss what actually is degeneracy and decadence. Tim.
If one could make the strongest criticism by paleo-cons of libertarianism in general or modern society, sort of an issue that divides certain kinds of libertarians, and we're still somewhat libertarians here, it's probably degeneracy and decadence here, or maybe even liberalism in general here. And I think it's not that hard to say that we live in a decadent age here. Maybe it's not quite a rerun of the 1920s, but we have a significant amount of inflation, significant amount of spending of money in the past 2 years, inflation of the money supply here. We've also had the United States. Now, Britain played a smaller role, but we had the war in Afghanistan. Not sure the actual price tag. There's probably a larger price tag of it, which basically after maybe they caught the guy, they should just ended it. But it was basically another pointless war, which spilled over into Syria and then turned into a migration crisis, sort of undermined that. You also have a few other pointless wars they fought that also contributed to that as well. So I would say we're living in a decadent age, and I would also say we're living in a degenerate age in somewhat. We're somewhat in decline. Even books like Tyler Cowen, libertarian-ish economist, wrote a book called The Great Stagnation. Probably more new things were invented probably before 1970 than after 1970, for example. But regardless of one's view on economic growth or anything like that, most Western governments here have had huge amounts of inflation increasingly, and there's nothing. The future doesn't look as bright as it did, say in 1960 or say in 2000. It's actually looking quite totalitarian in a way, with the sort of forced boosters and all sorts of things. You look at Australia. Australia has looked quite draconian. And internally, certain things are looking bad as well. I don't know if you walk around a supermarket or a store, you see obesity is on the rise. And again, I'm not fat shaming. And there are different types of fat people. I mean, it's one thing to see a piano mover type fat person. But this is, if you see a 40-year-old guy or girl in riding a scooter, that kind of obesity is way up. Childhood obesity is way up. I'm not just talking about big boned or pudgy people. I'm talking about people who can't walk up steps. And that's just sort of in some ways it's sad. In some ways it's horrifying. In some ways it's almost hilarious in a certain sense. As a kid, I always hated the movie WALL-E because I thought that seems like the future we're going towards. Is Disney really doing that? And that was one of the sad things about I would call it the scamdemic here. Human contact was basically shut down. Now, again, people had informal freedom. People just went out anyway, if you were allowed to. Some countries of Europe and Asia were much more draconian than the United States and Britain, to the extent they would force the rules. So, corporate-sponsored BLM protests were okay. Easter Easter services, Thanksgiving gatherings, not okay. I think the one Kentucky senator had a row with Fauci over this. What's the difference between a rally and a church service here? So we've seen obvious trend toward the tyranny there. And actually, California, the Supreme Court in California had to give a most favored nation clause. So MacArthur, a famous American Calvinist, had something like if nail salons and tattoo parlors are allowed to be open, other places should be allowed to be open as well. So we've seen inflation, we've seen a rise in obesity, and we've also seen a rise in the megacorps here. The megacorps have cleaned up recently against the petite bourgeois. Amazon stock is way up, Walmart stock is way up. So it's sort of funny about who's cheering on the recent things here. So I don't see a way out of this. I think we clearly are. I would assume you, Rik, would agree with this. So how would you disagree or agree with my statement here? Are we living in a decadent society? Are we living in a degenerate society? Do you agree, Rik? Thanks for being honest, by the way, as well.
Oh, not at all. I'm always grateful to be on your show. I really enjoy speaking with you two. defining degeneracy, I think, is something I find a little bit easier. Decadence, when you speak about decadence, I think it can tend to be a little bit more subjective in a lot of ways. So many of the things you were talking about there, Tim, I think we're informed heavily by the Christian background of the West, and I mean, certainly, I'm always, upfront and honest about this when I'm on your show. My own view, if I had to give an analysis, I think I'd just be leaning very heavily on my moral sensibilities as a Catholic. I'd be looking at the 7 deadly sins, and I would be making judgments about myself. Yes, but undeniably, I'd be doing so about other people. You mentioned obesity there. Immediately to me, that means gluttony. That automatically means an entropic decline in one's ability to, control oneself, to have a the wisdom, the temperance, as classic virtues, so that one is well in control of oneself. One is not a slave to one's passions, and in that sense, one reflects more of the qualities of God. And it's in that sense, you can speak of man being made in the image of God, but being an imager of God, sort of like a in the same way that a painting of a cat is, it's not the cat. It's an imperfect version of that. In the temporal world, man, being rational, is best placed to kind of reflect God, a sort of ideal, qualitatively perfect being. So I mean, I'd just be doing that. Now, if I had to try and be a bit more objective about what decadence is, and to some extent degeneracy, I had the pleasure of reading 2 very short books, essays, I would say, by 2 authors in the 20th century. One is called John Glubb, and the other one is called Hubbard. I can't remember his first name. But it's quite interesting because they independently named their essays the same title. It was called The Fate of Empires. And they were both looking at the decline of the British Empire in the early 20th century. I thought that was quite interesting that they were both doing the same thing, same title. So I read them both. And also interesting, they basically came to the same conclusion. They were looking historically at nations, empires, civilizations, if you will, and more recently nation states as well. And Glubb in particular noted that it seems like there's typically a life cycle to these larger groupings of humans that sort of rises maybe through military power or cultural influence, and then there's a decline. And interestingly, statistical data, more recent techniques have shown that 250-year period for the growth and decline of empires, especially, that is a very strong trend. So Glubb was actually right there. It seems to be 10 times a human generation, if you think about it like that. And they also said, so why does an empire rise? What's causing it to rise in the first place, to the point that you would maybe point back and say, oh, look, there's a golden age there, or something like that. And weren't the people so virtuous back then? And so, basically, it seems to be, there'll be some military conquest, there'll be some cultural influence, and an empire will grow. And, it's a case of, hard times make strong men. Strong men create good times. And the empire grows and it reaches its sort of optimum growth. And then the competition starts to turn inward. It starts to look within. Obviously, an era of peace, the sort of Pax Romana, if you will, where trade is then able is facilitated. Trade can happen much more readily, much more easily. Fear of bandits and that kind of stuff. And commerce, internal competition in commerce then becomes the battleground, if you will. And it seems that the virtues of people, and again, this is being objective. This is not just looking in Europe or the West. This is looking in the Middle East. This is looking in the Far East as well. It seems that then, an era of what they would have called decadence back then starts to set in. And basically what they see occurs is people go from generally thinking of virtues as being a sort of public spiritedness, a sense of duty. You have a duty to your family, you have a duty to your people, your nation, the empire, whatever it is. And obviously, that's a much more martial thing as well, and it's much more masculine, I suppose, but in a sort of militaristic sense, in a sort of old aristocratic sense. And then that gets turned when there's this internal sort of financial competition that goes on. That gets turned to a more selfish, maybe much more nuclear family oriented, focus on my little fiefdom, my dynasty, my land. These former warriors, they would become landed gentry very often, and then that internal competition reduces that public spiritedness. So they would see that as being decadence. If you have what was once very successful, very imperial sort of growth, and then financialization of the economy comes, and the virtues of the people become much more about status in terms of money. And something else that they noted were, across the board, was that actors and sports figures like that, they start to become the idols of the people. They start to become the ones that statues are made of. They start to be the people that the public most want to emulate. Yes, there's one other point I was going to make there, but basically that's. Oh yeah, the other thing was that they say also that the intellectual class starts to become that much more important to the elites, because of course they need a body of sort of academics, sages, whatever it's going to be, to justify this radical change in the virtues of the people. And so, they have to justify it by saying, oh, those former days of warlike glory, oh, well, that was bad. The days of yore where, our heroes were warriors, that was all bad. And we reject that now. We move beyond that, and we've outgrown that. And then of course there's the justification of things being much more individualistic in that economic sense. Now, whether you agree with them or not, but that's decadence. Certainly, what it does is it causes empires to decline and to crumble. No, a libertarian might look at that and say, well, okay, but actually I kind of like that, because what we're talking about here is also nation states and perhaps quite tyrannical political arrangements that are crumbling, and what would then grow out of that is much smaller political arrangements. After all, that's what the Greek polis was. It was emerging from a dark age after the collapse of several empires at once from the Bronze Age, and so even there, can you call that decadence? I suppose if it leads to a dark age and tremendous difficulty that would then have to be outgrow. You'd have to build from the ground up thereafter. In that sense, in the sense of making life more difficult, in the sense of even ending life, reducing the quality of life, I suppose we could definitely say that it's degenerate in the proper sense of the word degenerate. I don't know what you'd have to say on my thoughts there. I hope I haven't gone off too much of a tangent.
Oh no, far from it. That was those two authors putting sort of historical context of empires is quite interesting. When it comes to the term decadence and degeneracy, etc., it depends how you kind of want to define them in certain respects. And the question is, to what extent are they meaningful? Although it does make sense that, as you point out, as a society becomes relatively richer from this space, it then focuses itself more on sort of wealth and riches and comfort than it was able to do beforehand. Which isn't to say that comfort and wealth are bad per se, but rather the focus on there as being something we should aim at. That's kind of like the goal, as it were, rather than sort of like general consequence of living sort of like a virtuous life as such. When it comes to sort of decadence in general, the way I would tend to conceive of it as, Tim mentioned the 1920s. In a way, decadence is sort of like the vice of excess to a large extent. It's about indulgence and taking comfort or drink or all these sort of, as it were, worldly pleasures, and just sort of indulging and going all the way. There's a lack sort of temperance, as it were. And it's interesting you mentioned like the and this was sort of like the opposite of sort of like a very ascetic society, very much the opposite of, say, Sparta. I don't think anyone's going to go around and say the Spartans were decadent, particularly. That would be an idiosyncratic use of the word decadent there. So, you mentioned the 7 deadly sins is interesting. I think pretty much every single one could be laid at the door of the current society. Sort of lust, yes, a lot of it. Gluttony, clearly, with overconsumption. Greed, trying to earn not just earning necessarily, but the desiring others' wealth, etc. Sloth, possibly among certain peoples, although I don't think that's necessarily society's hugely slothful. Obviously there are elements that are. I would be sort of, it's hard to say overall with that. Is it a wrathful society? Yeah, in certain ways. Envy, well, obviously, that's pretty obvious, general policy. And then pride, well, we have pride marches, so I think that's pretty obvious that pride is pretty darn high there. So yeah, I think the way I would generally see is its decadence is in contrast to essentially asceticism. And so if you have sort of a continuum of sort of the ultimate asceticism, complete decadence, a form of temperance in the middle. It's pretty clear that society now, much more than say 40 years ago, in the 1940s, is very much more towards the decadent end rather than the ascetic end.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there quickly, Sylvan, thank you for actually properly answering Tim's question for me, because Tim did actually ask, do I think that we're living in a decadent time right now? And you have just applied my own moral standard to the time that we're living in now. And so, by that standard, yes, it does seem as though we're living in a decadent age. So yeah, thank you for that.
You don't necessarily need to take sort of like the 7 deadly sins as such. I just think if you just look at it on the basis of asceticism and sort of indulgence, I mean, that's pretty, high up in the Western world. I mean, it's even used actually as a metric. Indulgence and restraint is used by a social psychologist called Gert Hofstadter, who ranks countries based on various of his psychometric measures. And his thing is actually used in business to try and understand international markets. And unsurprisingly, the Americans come out very high on indulgence, much more so than, say, the Chinese or other countries. I think the Americans come out over the highest, I think, there. So the indulgence restraint sort of axis is not unique, and I don't think sort of necessarily morally normative in a sense, but rather I think is a relatively fair description of the state of things. Tim, any comments so far?
Oh yes. As far as this is one of the areas where I think libertarians have a sort of special insight to the argument discussion compared to conservatives, because of the sort of, especially the Ron Paul type, Misesian type ones, because the focus on sound money here. One of the reasons why you'd save is you could have more future goods. It's time preference here. And as I stated in my opening monologue there, we've had a lot of short-term spending here. And it's sort of funny. It all goes to like Amazon consumer goods. A lot, not all of it, but a good portion of it goes to useless, air quote, somewhat useless, I should say, stuff and consumer goods here. As your point about sports being popular, sports and entertainment, entertainers being popular is also probably worth noting there. That was actually one of the Peter Hitchens was asked in an interview, what he made of sports. He said one of the things about the Soviets would obsess over sports, and the Soviets sort of fell apart as well. So the obsession over like professional sports to the point of, to use idolatry, is probably also not very good there for the health of either the United States or Britain. As far as moving on here, is this just cyclical? John Gray, sort of historian, was talking about the ancient Greeks, and apparently ancient Greeks had a more circular view of time periods here. Whether they did or not is some question. I'm sort of taking it his word for it. I always thought that was sort of interesting here. That you brought up the poem about the good times leading to bad. Good times create weak men. Good times create weak men. Was this just somewhat inevitable here? We did have a series of economic inventions. We did have a long period of peace here. Read someone like Peter Zeeland. Whatever you think of NATO or the Second World War, we did have amongst the, so to speak, Western developed societies, there was a period. Everything west of Berlin was basically peaceful. Lots of internal trade, internal travel, and so forth here, which was quite the upside here. So was this just sort of an inevitable period of, you get a generation or two out of that, and now we're just sort of coasting? Rik, what would you make of those comments? The cyclical nature of society.
Yeah, I'm very pleased actually you brought up that idea of the cyclical nature of things, and I do think you're right. I think a lot is a mountain is made of a molehill of certain Greek thinkers, pre-Socratics, especially by thinkers like Alain de Benoit, who's a French new right thinker, nouveau droit. Really, I mean, the Greeks had linear ideas of time as well, but I do think that there is something perennial about perennial thinking about society, about civilizations, about empires, and one of the two authors I was speaking about before, Hubbard, is very interesting because he said, okay, yes, these empires rise and fall. But what about these instances in China or Europe where it seems that there is a general cultural civilization that is sort of I want to say coasting, like you said there, Tim, but it's sort of riding these waves. and the civilization itself is not actually properly collapsing. It's not dying. It's having summers and winters. It's become a perennial thing, not a sort of, what's the opposite? An annual plant, that you just plant the seed and it's dead within a year. It's coming back. It's found a way to ride out these things. And his conclusion was that it is the religious motive, but he's a little bit more specific than that. He points to certain aspects of Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, those ideas in the Far East, and obviously he points out especially certain things about Christianity in Europe that provided people not necessarily the ascetic thing. Southern was talking about how that's the opposite of what we might call decadence in some ways, but just this idea that you've got a transcendent view about yourself and about the world, which means that to an extent you're not thinking in short term. You're just inclined. It's called a religious motive. Basically, it's providing an incentive there for people in a culture just to be thinking generally in a more low time preference, long term. So you're thinking more about, say, the race, which is the society across time, than you are about your immediate society, or even just yourself. To be, very imminent, to be selfish. That really struck a chord with me. It resonated, it seemed to make sense to me. And I don't think it's bias. And once again, I think since he wrote that, I think so many, from so many different angles, from so many different fields of study, that has, just been strengthened. The idea that, of course, if people are being more self-sacrificing in a society, more public-spirited even, then they're not going to be as selfish. They're not going to be, they'll be more concerned with their personal spiritual development. I want to say, and what I mean by that specifically is development of themselves in terms of higher ideals, more abstract concepts, than their material development in the short term. It's very obvious, but the fact that you can actually look at that and get empirical data for in terms of degeneracy, not necessarily just in an individual's life, but in terms of a larger self-propagating system, like an empire, like a nation. You can see that there are cultural trends which are degenerate, and there are cultural trends which are, what can I say, generate. They lead towards life, even that spiritual life that that Christ spoke of. It's not just about live your best life now. No, it's about finding a fulfillment that transcends you. And when people in a society tend to live that way, everyone seems to benefit from that. It tends to create civilizations that last, and they can weather the storms. They can grow back. They can bloom again after winters have passed. And I guess that's my final thought on it. Really, that's I conclude with her, but I think that he's right.
Swethan, do you have any further comments on the cyclical nature of decadence and degeneracy?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I think that the cyclical nature of it is almost certainly true. Now, to what extent it can be mitigated is another question. But the classic example of this would be sort of like the children of like the millionaire, the father who spent hours and hours building up his empire of some description, and that then his children then live in luxury from a young age, never known anything different, and sort of lack character as such, and then they have no idea how to do anything, and generally just pleasure-loving individuals who squander the money, and then the sort of family then ends up with, well, becomes relatively poor, and then you can kind of go for a cycle again. Which is why historically sort of like the aristocracy were always very much on relatively, I won't say harsh, but they had very much a sense of duty to sort of impart onto their children, so that they would not just be pleasure lovers, and would be sort of socially useful, as it were. With respect to Tim, you mentioned sound money. I do think it's noteworthy that the decadence of the 1920s was really, you could very clearly say, is sort of caused by the Federal Reserve that really started getting going properly after the First World War. I mean, there's a big recession in 1920, but then you get massive increases in the money supply, very much short-term approaches to things, and you can't look sort of long term. And I think that actually relates as well to the public spiritedness, as Rik has pointed out. That had been an important point of what characterizes a decadent and non-decadent society. Is it is always, well, I suppose you could say it's not always, but you're always going to be looking out for, at least immediately, your own interests and you of your immediate family. Once you're stable and you have sort of a stable sort of situation, you can then look further and beyond yourself, after sort of like the castle, as it were, is fortified. With continuous inflation and debasement of the currency and debasement of savings and whatever, you can't just sort of fortify yourself financially, because if you could save and you knew that the value of your savings would be relatively constant, or even better, go up slightly, you'd be in a relatively stable situation, and then you could kind of look beyond yourself more easily. But I think the way in which the financial system operates these days makes that somewhat more difficult. Also, I suppose with decadence as well, one of the reasons why I'd be interested to see if there was a correlation between Hofstadter doesn't measure this, so I don't know, a correlation between indulgence and physical mobility. What do I mean is, how far away do you live from where your parents lived? When you're in sort of a hypermobile society where people move around for work constantly and are never really in any particular place for a long period of time, again, there's very little reason for you to have any sort of long-term orientation, because there's the sort of benefits of sort of investing in a local community. Well, there isn't much point because you're going to leave, so why bother? So I think that's a particularly more contemporary cause, something that, well, I mean, maybe precursors to some extent, but isn't really anything that's going to be something you see historically before, say, the 20th century, because the internal mobility is massively higher. I mean, England was historically relatively geographically mobile, but nowhere near to the same extent as it was today. So I do think that's an interesting note there. But to return to your question, I mean, it's undoubtedly going to have cycles, because you look at your parents, they do things, you go, no, they should have done something else, something slightly different. So you do that, and then so what I mean, you might always strive for sort of the golden mean, but you're always going to go one side or the other, and then in almost all cases, sort of your children will react to whichever side you are on and go the other side. So cycles of certain forms are inevitable. The question is, to what extent can you make the cycle stable and not going to lead to sort of like full-on collapse? That's what I'd say.
Exactly. I'd agree entirely. I think that's the question. I'm sorry, Tim, I'm jumping in here a bit, but
No, go for it. Go ahead.
yeah, you see, that's where I see there's that intrinsic link with degeneracy, because I see these rises and declines. That automatically impacts your ability to raise a family. It impacts the birth rates. It has an impact on the life of the larger unit than just the individual. It then has an impact on you have massive urbanization, for instance, with massive financialization of the economy as well. And obviously, you mentioned the Federal Reserve. Since that time, certainly we've seen this from throughout the 20th century, especially until now. People are having less children in the West. They're far less inclined to have children. They behave more like children. The adults, certainly. There's a place where you go to paint ceramic pots near me. It's called Arty Pots, and most of the time it is women in their 30s that are there. They clearly don't have children. Anyway, and then there'll be me there with my larger number of children. Being more conservative, having those natural inclinations. And you don't have to look very far. It's hardly a secret. It's beyond obvious now. And so immigration is then sort of, because we have greater technology now, immigration is sort of there to plug this gap, supposedly. Whereas the real issue is, what is it about the culture that is making us so weak that our birth rates are plummeting? We're not able to ride out this winter. Demographic winter is fast approaching the West, and immigration of people from other countries where they may come here, but there's zero guarantee that they're suddenly going to have low time preference, for instance, and they're going to start thinking far off into the future, or for instance that they'll ever properly sever ties with their country of origin, or their culture. All sorts of like massive demographic questions come into play. And then you can look over, say, at a country like Hungary, or you can look at Poland, I suppose, is another example. And they're saying, no, we want to maintain our religion, we want to maintain our identity, and so we're going to do whatever we can to try and increase birth rates and ride this out, but ride it out as us, as our people. There's financial, massive financialization of a country's economy. It seems to do something to the people where they become very, very individualistic, in the sense of, like you say, Swithin, living in an urban environment, so not a multi-generational home. They will probably not themselves be looking after their parents in their old age. They may not have children, or they will have children late because her biological clock is driving her mad, and they may have one and they have it rather late. And yeah, that's the situation. Terribly individualistic. Now, in the sense, in the proper meaning of the word degenerate, sort of against life, generation of life. There's definitely a link there. It's undeniable. We're seeing that now. And yeah, once again, I'd have to agree with Hubbard. I think it's the religious motive there, and especially in those people who have a natural inclination towards that. Those are the people, and that is the culture, the cultural technology that will then create the institutions that causes a civilization to ride out the winter, whether there is enough of a truly Christian kind of hardcore, whether these bastions still exist throughout the West or whether they are in the world, so that what we currently call Western civilization, that will somehow re-emerge and bloom again somewhere. Obviously, that remains to be seen. But if anything has a chance of doing it, it would be that, I'd argue.
Well, that's excellent. That basically ends my questions for here. Enjoyed doing it. Swithin, do you have any further comments here?
No, only insofar as I think one aspect that you could say is more degenerate of today's society than sort of historical ones is that we have a sort of culture in which sort of nature doesn't exist and reality is there merely to be conformed to the individual's will, including his own body. I'm thinking here primarily of lots of trans aspects, including transableism, transhumanism, and the other one, trans dinosaur. These sorts of things, it's like, well, there's nothing there. It's just when away in today's society, people are treated essentially as irrational and slaves of passion, and that's a sense sort of indulged and is able to be given the ability to be achieved because of modern technology. And I think now, whilst that's always been true to some extent, the more technology you have, the more you'll be able to do that. I think we're kind of at a much sort of higher level. I mean, one really weird one was apparently now with like some VR, they've got some algorithm to basically like resurrect your dead child, and then you can meet them in some weird sort of VR afterlife, which is odd, to put it mildly. And so again, you could say that could be a situation of people in society not be able to deal with death and try to live on in some sort of weird disembodied kind of existence. It's kind of getting similar to sort of like your consciousness being uploaded to the cloud, which was part of a Doctor Who episode that Stephen Moffat wrote. I can't remember what it's called. But yeah, so that's something else you could point to possibly, which is particularly noteworthy about today's society relative to historical ones. Just like to thank Rik for joining us. Any final comments?
I'm I don't mean to cut you short.
No, go for it.
I suppose you've got another 10 minutes to go potentially, but I'm so glad that you brought all of that up, because I see that again as being so intrinsically tied to the spiritual question of it all. I think the wokeism of today, which leads to all of the different kind of trans ideas, transcending the physical self. It's basically just Gnosticism, which is essentially a spiritual individualism. It's the rebellion of Satan against God. It's the rebellion of Prometheus against Zeus. It's the individual reducing right down to the most inner ego, because that's what they feel they have some element of control over, and rejecting everything else, rejecting the natural order is very much what Gnosticism has always been about. And it's this hatred that the will is not free because of the limitations supposedly of being embodied physically. And of course, then, that's going to lead people into some say, I want to be a dinosaur, or, whatever it is, maybe joking about. I don't even know. Things are so weird now, Stephen. I don't even know if you were joking about the trans dinosaurism, but I wouldn't find it surprising. I wouldn't find it surprising now, because because of the very, very Gnostic religion, which has, totally taken control. And Tim, I think you mentioned John Gray earlier. John Gray wrote a book which was very prescient about the trend towards Gnosticism, especially in the past 30 years, called The Soul of the Marionette. Some really insightful thoughts in there.
Yes, very pessimistic and very excellent.
Yeah, it was, but you can totally see how we are where we are now, and I would say that this is very much tied into what we were talking about in terms of the life cycle, the kind of perennialism of larger human groupings, of empires and that sort of thing. Because you've got to ask yourself, are you a part of some larger corporate body, whether that's, the body of Christ, or whether that is, you see yourself as intrinsically tied to, a race of people that transcends, as your ancestors, but it's also, you're a part of a process that's reaching forward into time. Do you see yourself as being intrinsically a part of a natural grouping and a natural order in the world, or do you reject that out of a very boyish kind of rebellious individualistic spirit? You despise the world, and you just sort of hope that you trust in the science, and you just trust that technology is just going to at some point relieve you of your physical body, your most inner ego or will you imagine can somehow be separated from your body in any sensible way, and I don't know, it's uploaded into a computer. Let's hope it doesn't run on Windows, or not many better options, I suppose. But yeah, I mean that is the spirit of our time, and that is why the spirit of our time is so very childish. Like Satan, like Prometheus, it's a very bratty kind of teenage rebellious spirit, which is very useful to humans. Humans are very adaptable because we have this side to ourselves where we can say, "Now I'm going to do my own thing," and be innovative. And it's meant that people can adapt to all the different environments in the world, and then cultures can kind of cement around those new ideas, and new schools of thought can emerge to help us along in many ways. But what we've got now is a kind of hyper individual, and it's a hyper novelty, hyper rebelliousness away from any natural grouping. It's viewing it as all limitation. And I mean, that's why I see, ideas about corporatism, especially Christian ideas about corporatism, about us being a part of the body of Christ, and that not being a bad thing. That's a good thing. I mean, yes, okay, we're consumed into the body of Christ, and also, in the Eucharist and the elements of the bread and the wine, we're consuming the body of Christ. But the nature of this world is that you're going to get chewed up, and you're going to be a part of something. Like you have to grow up in a culture. You have to grow with a language. Are those things necessarily evil? Is it necessarily a limitation? Does it have to be something that you strike out against, or is there a harmony? Is there a balance? Some reconciliation to be achieved? Yeah, I mean, those are my final thoughts there. But once again, I think that the religious motive has a huge part to play in the perennial life of a civilization, of an empire, maybe, and necessary to that, you have to make some sacrifices. You have to make some sacrifice. You have to give of yourself, to give and not count the cost. Very hard to do. How do you motivate people towards that? Well, through love, I think. and that's the Christian message, and that's what I hold to. So I guess I'm ending where I started, really, aren't I? Just sort of leaning back onto my Christian moral sensibilities. But it's a good place to be.
Thank you again for joining us, Rik. With the I'm not aware of trans dinosaur, but I am aware of somebody who had plastic surgery to make himself look like an elf. So I do know that is true. I believe it was in Brazil. He made his legs longer and gave him pointy ears. So maybe the dinosaur will come soon. I'm not aware of the dinosaur quite yet, but I wouldn't be surprised. And now I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. And please subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.